Hi, you're on the Nomad of Dreams channel. Today, I'll talk about the philosophy of Sergius Radonezhsky. We will discuss those spiritual and moral principles that shape inner life and public habits. We'll analyze why these ideas retain power in personal practice and in social relations. Where are you listening to me from right now, and what time is it there? Write in the comments. I like seeing the geography and the time. Do a small bodily anchor. Exhale deeply, release the tension in your shoulders. Feel a steady breathing rhythm. Let that sound become the beginning of attention. Sergius Radonezhsky appears as a thinker for whom spiritual life is a field of practical rules and images that set the measure of behavior and perception. His thought represents a system of moral guidelines and ways of seeing the world through the prism of prayer, humility, and service to the community. It is precisely the practical orientation that makes these ideas able to live beyond the confines of a particular time. They offer not abstract dogmas, but developable skills of inner work and social interaction. This way of thinking works because it connects inner discipline with everyday activity, making life an environment of constant schooling for the soul. The key axis is the understanding of revelation as a normative principle. Revelation here plays the role of a criterion that guides moral choices and shapes the measure of behavior. Such an understanding makes knowledge of God not a private privilege, but a guiding principle for the whole of life. In this position, there is no distance between faith and deed. Knowledge of God becomes the measure of actions, not an element of intellectual play. This idea by itself leads to a number of practical conclusions. Prayer ceases to be idle speech. Humility becomes a method of knowing. Obedience serves as a way of cultivating character, and the community becomes a natural school for the soul. Prayer and inner presence occupy a central place in this system. Prayer is understood as a technique of prolonged concentration, as the ability to keep attention on what is truly important. Such prayer is not reduced to a set of words. It becomes a way to live in constant contact with deep sources of meaning. As a result, inner silence changes the perception of the world. Familiar irritants lose their power, and actions acquire a new direction. Inner silence becomes a filter for desires and fears. It creates conditions for the growth of honesty and clarity. When attention stabilizes, actions gain unity with the striving for the good. Humility in this picture fulfills an epistemological function. Modesty is not declared a form of self-abasement. It is offered as a path to clear knowledge of oneself and of what truly matters. Humility makes it possible to recognize one's motives and weaknesses. As a result, a space for change opens up. A person learns to see their tendencies and to work with them. This modest attitude toward oneself affects how authority is formed, how decisions are made, and how relationships within the community are built. Obedience acts as an educational mechanism. By obedience is meant the readiness to follow rules and counsel that test the will and shape character. Through obedience, a habit of discipline is produced, a habit of hearing and responding to demands different from momentary desires. Obedience forms the reasoning capacity, develops the ability to render decisions without yielding to impulses. This approach to obedience frees a person from the need to constantly prove they are right and creates conditions for genuine work on oneself. Ascetic practices in this system function as techniques of freedom. Labor, abstinence, daily routine, and bodily effort become instruments that strengthen the will and make it capable of choosing toward values rather than momentary pleasures. Asceticism illuminates the will, helping to clarify what truly governs actions. This is not a display of strength. It is an exercise for the will, a path to greater inner autonomy. The community is perceived as a living organism where personality develops differently than in solitude. Communal life creates a space for the constant training of virtues: patience, humility, love for one's neighbor. Here, experience is transmitted not through abstract admonition, but through living days together, through shared labor and prayer. Such transmission makes wisdom dense and accessible. It roots moral guides in everyday life. The unity of labor and prayer becomes one of the cornerstone principles. Work is perceived as a continuum of service and prayerful attention. Labor is not detached from spiritual meaning, and prayer does not retreat into merely personal experience. As a result, a way of life is formed in which work and prayer support each other, creating a stable platform for spiritual growth. This combination changes the usual division between the sacred and the secular, offering another way to perform everyday duties. An important moral rule is the non-use of force as a method for resolving conflicts. Coercion is rejected as a method of asserting truth. Persuasion and moral force prove more effective than violence. Such a principle affects the nature of leadership and governance. Authority is judged by the ability to serve, not by the capacity to suppress. This leads to the formation of moral structures where trust and example are stronger than formal coercion. Holiness here appears as a social resource. Personal holiness affects the atmosphere around a person, creating conditions for calm and harmony in the community. Holiness does not remain a private phenomenon. It manifests in how a person acts among others, how they influence the general climate and behavior. The influence of the holy is measured not by words, but by changes in relationships and habits in society. Remember that these principled points form a system in which faith serves as a mode of perceiving the world, and service becomes the criterion of genuine authority. In the next part, attention will shift to prayer as inner silence and the technique of constant presence. Here, we will consider what constant presence in everyday life actually means, which practices stabilize attention, and what limits this path has. Prayer is inner silence and the technique of constant presence. It is not rhetoric and not a set of words, but a steady state of attention that accompanies you in life and forms the inner measure of actions. Inner silence means the ability to hold focus on the deep center of meaning. It is not an emptiness of thought, but an attentive mode in which desires, fears, and habitual reactions cease to dictate the course of the day. In such a state, a person hears the subtle movements of conscience, recognizes impulses, and sees paths that were previously closed by the noise of inner voices. Attention becomes an instrument, and through this instrumentality, perception itself changes. The world stops seeming like a collection of external stimuli. It becomes a field for a conscious response. The technique of constant presence is composed of simple established practices. Repetition of short prayers, attention to the breath, the rhythm of worship, an ordered daily routine, and work done with prayer form the framework. This framework makes the state of presence not an episode, but a habit. Muscular attention develops in a similar way. At first, it is formed in a steady exercise, then it penetrates ordinary actions, and finally, it sets the tone of life. Through this formation, moral perception also changes. Decisions are made under greater clarity, and actions receive a unified guidance. How does this work in practice, and why is the effect long-term? The brain and the heart get used to responding to the same signals. If you repeat the prayerful rhythm and return to the center, neural pathways strengthen and impulsive reactions weaken. At the same time, the ability to distinguish motivations develops. What moves an action? What is the consequence of passion? And what is a response to duty? This discernment creates space for choice, and within it, freedom appears to act according to values rather than fleeting impulses. Emotional stability is not a secondary result. When attention is steady, fears and irritations no longer color every situation. This means that communication becomes less dependent on mood and more on a constant inner measure. Inner presence does not make a person cold. It makes them capable of hearing another more deeply, responding with greater care, and maintaining clarity under pressure. Such clarity serves as a moral orientation. An action is judged not by external benefit, but by its accord with the inner center. The limits and demands of this practice are clear. Presence requires regularity and discipline. It works when there is systematic practice, not occasional impulses. To maintain such a state, you need a community and a mentor who help keep the path and discern errors. The technique does not absolve one of responsibility for one's actions. It does not provide ready-made solutions and does not replace wise judgment. There is also the danger of inner closure, when silence becomes a way to escape real obligations. To avoid this, a combination of humility and accountability to others is required. The role of the bodily side cannot be underestimated. Posture, breathing, and labor have a direct impact on concentration. Work with the hands and prayer go together. The body fixes the rhythm of attention, and the prayerful state becomes accessible during working days. Correct bodily discipline supports the inner center, while excessive asceticism without guidance can destroy the overall orientation. Here, discernment and sound judgment are important. The social effect of constant presence manifests in the quality of life around the person. When someone lives in this mode, words and gestures gain weight, decisions acquire consistency, and the community atmosphere becomes more stable. A leader who preserves prayerful presence sets the tone for service and responsibility. The influence of such a person is measured not by public rhetoric, but by changes in everyday practices and relationships among people. The connection of this idea with the personality of Sergius Radonezhsky is obvious and multifaceted. Sergius Radonezhsky understood prayer as a constant state of the heart that should accompany labor and life in the community. His approach was practical. Prayerful silence was sustained by routine, labor, and communal prayer, which made presence stable and socially influential. In his experience, prayer acted not as a personal paraphrase of faith, but as a norm that transforms character and social relations. I have seen how this principle works in different contexts. Constant presence changes relationships within a group, changes the meaning of work, and gives a matter the authority. Sergius Radonezhsky perceived prayerful attention as an instrument of moral upbringing. Through it, patience, responsibility, and the capacity to serve are formed. The influence of this practice goes beyond individual experience and becomes a factor of social stability. The conclusion is simple. Prayer, as inner silence, is a skill that requires discipline, community, and discernment. It changes the perception of the world, strengthens the will, and serves as a moral measure of actions. Sergius Radonezhsky showed that constant presence is possible in real life, and that its fruits are noticeable in a person's character and in the quality of communal life. The problem is that humility often becomes a word with empty meaning. It is reduced to outward modesty, to a humble appearance, to acquiescence for the sake of peace, or to self-devaluation for the sake of a good reputation. In such use, the depth is lost. Humility ceases to be a way of life and turns into a mask that is put on at convenient moments. The consequences of such simplification are obvious. Decisions are made under the pressure of external expectations, inner honesty retreats into the shadows, and the person remains captive to habitual roles and fears. A blurring of conscience and the loss of bearings arise because the world exists, but there is no criterion for life. The criterion of true humility is formulated differently. Humility appears as a way of knowing oneself and God. It rests on honesty about one's limitations, on readiness to be corrected, on attention to the motives of one's actions, and on openness to examination by others. Humility manifests in the willingness to accept the truth about oneself even when it is unpleasant, and in the ability to act out of responsibility rather than out of the desire for approval. On a practical level, this means constant checking of motives, sincerely asking for advice, readiness to lose status for the sake of mission, work on mistakes, and the ability to acknowledge guilt without excuses. It is precisely these signs that allow one to distinguish humility as a quality of spirit from humility as a social strategy. When humility has such criteria, the consequences are deep and lasting. On a personal level, an awakening of self-knowledge occurs. A person stops feeding on their own role and begins to see real weaknesses and gifts. This knowledge starts a process of inner work. Habits change, passions quiet, decisions are made with greater composure. Inner strength appears not as pride, but as honesty, freedom from the need to maintain an image. At the community level, such humility builds trust. People who acknowledge their mistakes and are ready to correct them become a support point for others. Leadership built on this foundation gains legitimacy through service rather than through formal authority. The leading role turns into constant work for the good of others, and around it, a milieu arises where responsibility and truth are valued above image. There are also negative paths that false humility can take. Under the guise of modesty, they may hide passivity, avoidance of responsibility, a desire to manipulate pity, or a fear of defending oneself. Such a form acts as a brake. It blocks the correction of mistakes and hampers sincere dialogue. Internally, it feeds pride because repeated displays of an allegedly humble demeanor become a means of managing impressions. This leads to a split between words and deeds, destroys trust, and makes the community vulnerable to internal disagreements. The boundary for the application of humility as a path to knowledge is clear and requires discipline. Humility does not arise spontaneously. For its formation, habits of honesty, regular self-evaluation, and accountability to those you trust are necessary. Practically, this means participation in life where there are elders or mentors, confession, obedience, and service. Self-knowledge is supported by labor and prayer, which return attention from the theater of external roles to the center of personality. Without this, humility risks remaining at the level of words and rituals, devoid of transformative power. A small example helps to see the dynamics. A person who is willing to admit a mistake in managing a community, and instead of defending status, engages in the work of restoring trust, signals that humility for them is not an outward pose, but a practical ability to learn and change. Such a gesture changes the tone of relationships and restores the meaning of authority as service. Humility requires courage. To admit guilt means to leave a comfortable position and allow yourself to be vulnerable before others. This is connected with the risk of losing face and with the necessity to endure imperfect understanding around you. But it is precisely through this risk that deep self-knowledge comes. Inner clarity frees the will. You begin to act out of real responsibility, not out of the need to conform to expectations. This leads to more mature decisions and to the ability to take difficult measures when needed, because motivation comes from real good, not from seeking approval. The connection of this approach with the spiritual experience of Sergius of Radonezhsky appears in his emphasis on a life where humility was not a word, but a pattern. Sergius of Radonezhsky saw humility as a method of training the heart and reason, which required trials, labor, and constant checking of motives. His life showed that humility makes a person capable of bearing responsibility rather than fleeing from it. At the same time, his humility was connected with love for the neighbor and with a demand for truth, not with conciliation for the sake of convenience. Practical limits must be considered when applying humility in public life. Humility does not remove the duty to protect the weak and does not cancel the need to speak the truth, even when it is inconvenient. In Sergius of Radonezhsky's historical experience, humility was combined with readiness for decisive action for the common good. Such a combination is a criterion of maturity. Humility that leads to labor, correction, and protection, not to withdrawal, is the fullness of virtue. If you want to test your own humility, keep a simple set of questions. What motives drive your actions? Are you ready to accept criticism and correct yourself? Do you take responsibility when something goes wrong? Use honest feedback from others as a mirror. In this process, humility becomes an instrument of knowledge, not a mask. Through honest work on oneself, not only an individual changes, the community changes because practices of truth, responsibility, and service are formed around it. And this is the deepest social benefit of humility that acquires a criterion and a living test. Obedience works as a trainer for the will and reason. An external request or rule serves as a reference point to which a person ties their action. Regular fulfillment of such points turns actions into habits, and habits form character. Through consistent fulfillment of directives, a person learns to overcome inner resistance, to distinguish true impulses from momentary desires, and to endure the tension of motivation. Obedience translates abstract ideals into firmly embedded practices, because it requires concrete steps and repetition. In this sense, obedience is a mechanism for transforming intention into deed. In short, the mechanism sets the rhythm of life and provides a bodily support for spiritual discipline. Often, it is the body that remembers what the mind long resisted. Why is this needed? Obedience builds a space of trust within the community. When people agree to follow common rules and carry out assignments, the chaos of actions decreases and the ability to achieve goals collectively grows. For spiritual growth, obedience provides a situation where motivations are checked, not by words, but by deeds. It helps to see where you are truly free and where you merely complied outwardly. Freedom is formed as the ability to choose responsibly under conditions of limitation, not as the possibility to do whatever one wants. It is precisely in limitation that the ability not to succumb to passions and to choose the good for its own sake is revealed. Ask yourself, for what do you obey? This question reveals the connection between obedience and freedom. The answer shows whether obedience is a form of fear, habit, or mature volitional choice. The mechanism breaks down where the connection between authority and moral competence disappears. If the one obeyed acts in the interest of their own power or personal gain, obedience becomes an instrument of subjugation without an educational purpose. When an instruction is given as an order without explaining its meaning, it suppresses reason and leaves a trace of automatic compliance. If regular demands are not accompanied by spiritual guidance, checking of motives, and sincere care for the obedient soul, the habit remains an external form that does not reach the heart. The consequences of this breakdown are seen in the loss of responsibility. People stop thinking, shift moral choice onto the command, and passivity, moral weakness, and hidden resentment accumulate in the community. On a personal level, the breakdown manifests in the loss of conscience as an inner measure. A person gets used to obeying without inner consent, and their inner voice becomes muted. This returns to a childish model of relations with authority, where responsibility does not grow from experience, but disappears under the pressure of external commands. The mechanism also fails when obedience is used as manipulation. If obedience is presented as proof of devotion and used to strengthen the ruler's status, then the very idea of obedience loses its therapeutic power. True obedience requires transparency of procedures and a willingness of authority to be accountable. When such constraints are absent, obedience ceases to be a school of freedom and becomes the fetters of submission. The point of restoration consists of several interrelated conditions. First, authority must possess personal spiritual competence, that is, the ability to explain the meaning of a command and to show its fruits in life. Second, obedience must be reversible by a test of conscience, the possibility to confess weaknesses, to discuss motives with a mentor, and to receive honest feedback. Third, the existence of control institutions prevents arbitrariness. Elders, a council of seniors, joint decisions create protection against abuse. These elements together turn obedience into a space of learning rather than an instrument of coercion. Sergius of Radonezhsky conceived of obedience as the training of heart and mind at once. For him, obedience was a school of patience, attentiveness, and inner discipline, but it also required the moral responsibility of those who lead. Harshness of power without love and without example loses its meaning, just as outward obedience without inner freedom is deprived of purpose. The practical test of obedience is simple. Ask yourself whether your compliance produces maturity of will, whether it helps you recognize and correct mistakes, whether it entails service to others. If obedience leads to active care for others and to the ability to bear personal responsibility, it performs its function. If it reproduces a chain of thoughtless subordination, changes are required in the organization of authority and in personal practice. My conclusion is as follows. Obedience is a means that makes freedom possible through discipline. Its strength manifests when it is joined with the moral example of a leader, with institutions of scrutiny, and with personal work on motivation. Then, obedience ceases to be an external constraint and becomes a path to maturity. Sergius of Radonezhsky showed this in life. Obedience, suffered and tested, gives rise to people capable of serving and accepting responsibility. If you accept obedience as a school rather than a label, it will become your tool of inner freedom and communal health. Practically, this looks like this. Establish clear rules, but explain their meaning. Require accountability, but treat it as a conversation about growth. Encourage initiative within the bounds of obedience so that the obedient person learns not only to submit, but also to think. Gradualness is important. Small assignments lay the foundation for larger decisions. Examples available for imitation are also necessary. Without them, the words of the rules remain empty. Finally, accompany obedience with prayer and reflection. Spiritual practice helps to heed the inner voice and turns external compliance into free service. Then obedience again becomes a bridge between the person and the community, between will and truth. Remember, obedience is not submission for the sake of submission. It is a way of educating reason and heart, where responsibility becomes a personal choice. Keep this meaning within you, and obedience will shine as a guide, not as darkness. Preserve the freedom of conscience, and it will multiply the fruit of obedience. Amen. Why does a person voluntarily limit the body and habits, and what happens to the will when asceticism begins? You may encounter this as a set of prescriptions or as a strange habit of monks, but the question itself is important. How do bodily exercises translate inner resistance into a free choice? Asceticism is systematic work with the body and attention, aimed at restoring control over impulses and purifying motivations. It is not a set of strange feats for the sake of shock value. I mean regular discipline, dietary restrictions, a sleep and wake regimen, manual labor, and simple physical fatigue, silence and imitation of visual and auditory stimuli. Such practices reconfigure the relationship between desire and reason. New habits are fixed in the body, and the mind learns to wait, to discern, and to choose. Sergius of Radonezhsky saw asceticism as an exercising will, as a demand on the body that helps the soul attain clarity. The mechanism works by reducing automatic reactions. When you cut down the number of stimuli and refuse easily accessible pleasures, habitual paths of gratification disappear. The free space between desire and action begins to widen. This space acts like a muscle. The more often you refrain from an immediate response, the longer you can sustain subsequent tension. One monk used to rise every night for a brief prayer, and after years said that he had learned to choose prayer instead of sleep as naturally as someone else decides to wash in the morning. Such a small example illustrates how repetition turns effort into habit. Forms of asceticism can be enumerated: fasting, manual labor, vigil, guarding the passions, silence, and limiting external impressions. Each form acts on a particular field of the will. Fasting affects the inclination toward immediate gratification. Labor develops patience and attention to work. Vigil teaches readiness and inner composure. Guarding the passions helps not to scatter energy on superficial desires. Taken together, these practices create a dense network of supports that holds the will in moments of temptation. Psychologically, this resembles a redistribution of resources. Previously, energy went to sustaining habitual pleasures and reacting to external stimuli. In asceticism, the same energy is redirected into heightened attention, endurance, and planning. Neural connections that once strongly held automatic reactions weaken, while new connections associated with choice and patience strengthen. I have seen how people's pace of life changes. What once required struggle at every impulse later becomes a clearer choice, and the struggle itself grows shorter. Sergius of Radonezhsky emphasized precisely this gradualness and the naturalness of growth. There is a bodily aspect that is often forgotten. The body remembers what the mind resisted for a long time. Through regulated labor, the hands and feet learn to sustain the rhythm of service, and this is reflected in the mind's decisions. A common example: when a person becomes accustomed to helping others in small ways, it becomes easier for them to perform larger acts of service without inner drama. Such a transition from small exercises to mature deeds is the essence of work on the will. The limits of this practice are obvious and must be spoken of plainly. Asceticism loses its meaning when it turns into self-praise or a way of asserting one's own righteousness. If the exercises serve demonstration and pride, they feed the very passions they were meant to heal. It is also dangerous when the ascetic burden exceeds physical capacity and causes harm to health. In such cases, benefit turns into destruction. The boundaries of discipline are set through care for both soul and body, through sober discernment, and through the counsel of those whom one can trust. Analytically, it looks like this. The cause is human inclination toward quick gain and instantaneous pleasures. The device is systematic bodily discipline that limits access to these pleasures and leaves space for choice. The consequences are increased endurance, purer motivation, and the ability to make decisions without succumbing to immediate passions. Such a device does not give an instant victory, but a change in the structure of character, which then acts differently. Asceticism is reflected in communal life as well. When a group of people coordinates a rhythm of work, prayer, and fasting, a common tempo forms that supports individual members. Assigned tasks and shared rules become a school of patience and mutual responsibility. It is precisely in this connection that individual practice gains support and a mirror. Sergius of Radonezhsky saw the monastery as a laboratory of character, where bodily exercises were combined with prayer and service to others. If you want to try, start small. Establish a simple eating regimen, set aside time for regular labor and short periods of silence. Ask advice from an experienced mentor, and watch your motives. Consistency is more important than dramatic effort. Gradualness and accountability help avoid pride and overstrain. Prayer and self-reflection accompany any bodily exercise, making it not a mechanical routine, but a path of inner growth. One could finish like this. Asceticism is a technique of freedom for the will, a path that trains endurance and purity of motives. Keep the boundaries of your body and conscience. Listen to the wisdom of elders, and remember that the goal of the exercises is growth in service and love. When the will becomes capable of waiting, choosing, and working for the good of others, then ascetic discipline reveals its true face. Sergius of Radonezhsky considered this one of the key methods of nurturing the soul. If you take up this approach consciously, it can become your instrument of growth. The result of a living transmission of experience through eldership is stable inner governance, observable both in individuals and in the overall character of the community. When an elder is present constantly, his influence becomes not verbal pressure, but an established layer of practice. People adopt his manner of praying, his inner silence, the habit of responding to injury with humility and acting out of duty rather than pride. This is expressed in everyday decisions: how to handle food, how to distribute labor, how to admit a younger monk into communal work. The consequences span time. One generation passes on not only rules, but also mood, the measure of effort, and a habit of viewing life through the prism of prayer and responsibility. After a few years, such an order no longer depends on a single charisma. It becomes part of the community's customs and language, changes the perception of power and authority, and forms people for whom service is a natural form of existence. Such a state forms for a simple reason. Eldership relies on personal connection, daily repetition, and sincere vulnerability. A living mentor does not hand out a set of tips. He lives nearby, takes part in the common routine, reacts in concrete situations, and thus demonstrates the norm. Through regular conversations, shared prayer, and joint labor, the transmission of ideas turns into imitation. The adoption of gestures and reactions that later become automatic. At the same time, the effect of trust works. When you see that a mentor renounces privileges for the common good, you begin to regard his word as tried. The reason for the effectiveness of eldership is not a pedagogical method, but the combination of example and the transfer of habits through common life. When each small action is repeated so often that it becomes part of character. Sergius of Radonezhsky understood that a mentor is needed not for quotations, but so that daily virtue enters into the very flesh of the community. It is necessary to clarify how exactly eldership structures learning and where its limits lie. The transmission of experience does not replace personal effort. The mentor provides guidelines and corrects, but the inner work must be done by each person himself. The role of the elder is also limited by the responsibility of the community and moral boundaries. His influence must be transparent and subject to verification, so that blind imitation does not arise. Eldership works through repetition, through rhythm, through the acknowledgement of mistakes and their correction in the interpersonal field. Sequence matters. Trust is built over years, and single gestures do not create lasting transmission. The presence of an elder does not replace books and rules. Written sources preserve formulas and theology, but living experience turns them into a breathing practice. These are the limits of the method. It amplifies and concretizes what exists at the level of spirit and habit, and at the same time requires communal responsibility and sober discernment. The name Sergius of Radonezhsky appears again here as a sign that the institution of wisdom is possible on the condition of humility, constancy, and a personal life that speaks more than words. The tie to our time and to the person of Sergius of Radonezhsky shows how eldership works within the system I have already described. In the structure of his thought, the mentor is not an official of power, but a person whose task is to live before others so that prayer and work become obvious guides. This means that you can look for such an exemplar in your own life. Pay attention to those who work constantly, who patiently correct mistakes, and who keep calm in difficult situations. If you enter a community or a group where eldership practice is present, observe the routine and ask about motives without demanding instant change. The words of an elder are significant because habit stands behind them, and habit is formed by action. And again, the name Sergius of Radonezhsky serves as a reminder that the transmission of holiness is a slow process requiring humility and time. It is impossible without trust and without a readiness to submit to common discipline for the common good. If you accept this disposition, eldership will begin to operate not as a dogma, but as an environment in which your decisions gradually become more mature and service more natural. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. Eldership cultivates endurance and responsibility. Through small tasks, habit, and the gift are formed anew. In particular manifestation, the life of the community is expressed in how ordinary care for bread, order, and prayer is distributed. When the common regimen becomes not a set of rules, but a way of life, every morning, every labor, every meal becomes a lesson. This is not about public speeches or ceremonial moments, but about how a small repertoire of actions is put together. Who gets up first for prayer? Who quietly straightens a blanket? Who carefully shares bread with a newcomer? It is within this everyday network of interactions that what later appears as character is formed. Habits grow into conscious intentions, and intentions are fixed by common language and customs. When there are people nearby ready to pray, to work, and to keep the same rule, personal transformation proceeds differently than in solitary asceticism. The conclusion from this particular case is simple. The community acts as an environment for educating the spirit. It is not a teacher in the classical sense. Its strength lies in constant reciprocity. Mutual oversight, gentle correction, shared labor, and communal prayer form a continuum where one person's experience becomes available to all. In such an environment, inner virtues do not remain abstractions. They are manifested in deeds, and therefore learning becomes bodily as well as intellectual. The notion of responsibility takes on flesh. You answer not only to your own conscience, but also to those who share your bread and labor. Summing up, the community appears as a spiritual organism in which personality is formed through relationships and rhythms. The inner life of the community relies on several stable mechanisms. First, the ritual of repetition turns random good acts into habit. Second, mutual attentiveness creates an environment where small violations are corrected quickly and unobtrusively before they grow into vices. Third, shared work discipline teaches endurance and patience, because work in common conditions requires aligning desires and compromise. Sergius of Radonezhsky saw communal life as precisely such a system, where prayer and deed fuse. For him, the constancy of common practice was more important than rare feats. The mechanics of this process often remain unnoticed. People think they grow through inspiration, whereas growth most often happens through repetition and correction. Inner changes are solidified when a common measure of assessment and encouragement appears at the level of language. Words become indicators of habits, and habits become the criterion of words. In the community, a memory of what is acceptable is formed, and the language of that memory transmits unwritten standards. It is this living standard that ensures deeds take precedence over ritual. Prayer retains meaning because it is connected to concrete, everyday care for one's neighbor. In this key, the name Sergius of Radonezhsky stands as a sign of attention to the unity of the prayerful and mundane way. His model shows how common practice fills words with content. The question arises how the community avoids becoming merely a group of social obligations. The answer is that the community's inner goal must be alive and clearly expressed. If the goal is the growth of the spirit through shared life, then every mundane detail serves that goal. When the goal is lost, rituals remain empty, and the community stops educating and begins only to maintain order. Therefore, the community, as an educational environment, needs clear orientations, a history, and wisdom that explains the meaning of ordinary tasks. Here again is the thought dear to Sergius of Radonezhsky. Leadership that guides the community must be a service grounded in prayer and labor, not a desire for power. The limits of communal education are important and obvious. The community creates conditions for growth, but does not guarantee it. It facilitates the formation of virtues, but does not remove the person's obligation for inner work. The limit is visible when responsibility and spiritual discernment are replaced by a structure of obedience without openness. When authority becomes ephemeral and opaque, the collective mechanism that should restore and correct turns into an instrument of pressure. To prevent this, transparency, accountability to tradition, and the possibility of external review of moral norms are needed. The community provides practice, but it requires institutionalized wisdom and sober discernment to preserve freedom of conscience and avoid formalism. Another limit relates to the heterogeneity of people. The community is not omnipotent in the face of the uniqueness of personal history and character. Some accept rhythms more easily, some resist. Therefore, the community must combine a firm regimen with respect for the individual path. Psychological traumas, personal inclinations, and external circumstances affect a person's ability to assimilate common practices. One cannot shift all responsibility for spiritual growth onto the environment. The community's role is to create favorable soil, to prepare opportunities for experiencing meanings, but the yield of each seed depends on how deeply roots have penetrated within. Practical conclusions apply outside the monastery. In families, in work collectives, in small societies, one can observe elements of communal upbringing. Shared labor, regular gatherings, common rituals of thanksgiving, honest feedback. This set helps form stable habits that then influence decisions and behavior. For you, this means paying attention to which rhythms and which norms are forming around you. If you strive for development, look for places where discipline is accompanied by love and where words are backed up by common deeds. Sergius of Radonezhsky offers us a mental model of such a life. It is available not only to monks, it is possible wherever people agree to live for a common purpose. To finish the thought, I note, the community as a place of spiritual ripening is a powerful tool, but it requires wise use. Whether you came into a group for convenience or for growth can be distinguished by observing how you treat one another in small things. If the small things teach kindness, if rules are open to discussion, if service is valued above titles, then the community works to make people more mature. I recall the image of Sergius of Radonezhsky as a reminder that communal life really forms character, provided it is guided by prayer and labor, not by the desire for control. If you look for such signs and are ready to participate in the routine, the communal method of upbringing may turn out to be for you a genuine space of transformation. The rule is simple and strict. Work and prayer are woven into a single exercise of life, where each task becomes prayer, and prayer brings spirit into the work. This is not a pretty metaphor, but a practical orientation. Attention directed toward God changes the quality of hands and mind. For Sergius of Radonezhsky, the unity of prayer and work was a recipe for spiritual endurance. He saw that prayerful concentration and bodily labor mutually support each other, forming habits of the heart. A short corollary of this rule: everyday discipline unfolds prayer from a moment into a way of life. When prayer becomes the background of any task, fatigue changes its tone, irritation softens, decisions are made differently. I am not speaking about rare episodes of inspiration, but about a constant practice in which small actions accumulate and change character. The question arises of the tension between the ideal and reality. Modern rhythms impose acceleration, distributed tasks, and commercial priorities that make the state of prayerful presence elusive. Work requires efficiency and speed. Prayer requires silence and attention. These demands can conflict at the level of the body and everyday habits. An analysis of the causes of this conflict shows several pressure points. The first point is the habit of separateness: home and church, work and prayer, inner life and external duties. The second is technology and noise, which fragment attention and reduce the possibility of sustained concentration. The third is social expectations that evaluate action by visible results, whereas spiritual fruit is often invisible and grows slowly. These tensions make the practical realization of the unity of work and prayer a difficult task. A small picture: a carpenter, habitually and carefully planing a board, quietly recites prayerful words. In his hands, the work becomes a continuation of prayer, and time acquires a different density. A shift from describing problems to analyzing mechanisms is necessary. Attention is the main resource, and its allocation decides everything. When attention is consumed by external demands, inner prayer becomes impoverished. Bodily exercises and ascetic discipline restore the capacity to hold attention for extended periods. Regularity of actions educates the will. Repetitions create expectation and structure within which prayer more easily enters the flow of work. Resolution is built through simple techniques and the organization of life. Establish rhythms that include short moments of mental prayer when transitioning from one task to another. Before beginning work, utter a short formula of blessing that orients the mind. Divide periods of work into segments of silent attention and mark the end of a shift with the practice of thanksgiving. Consistency and grounding in bodily gestures are important. A routine that has meaning becomes a bridge between existential fatigue and a sustained prayerful life. A practical measure is training attention through the body. Work duties can be carried out so that the breath serves as a metronome of inner concentration. Hand movements and steps accompanied by a short prayer. A teacher or elder helps consolidate the skill by showing how to combine a prayer formula with a specific movement. Sergius of Radonezhsky oriented the community toward a way of life where mentorship and the example of elders made the transition from word to deed possible and understandable. Organizational steps within the community ease individual practice. A schedule that alternates prayer and work reduces friction between the two spheres. Shared labor simplifies the maintenance of a prayerful disposition because communal prayer and a shared rhythm of work form a single counterpoint. Education that explains the meaning of daily tasks as service gives work a sacred weight, and helps people see in labor the expression of faith. The limits of the proposed solution are also clear. External orderliness alone does not guarantee an inner transition. Routine devoid of meaning turns into a mechanical sequence. Genuine union of prayer and work requires the consent of the heart and constant practice of discernment. Spiritual discernment and honest feedback from a mentor help recognize when a habit serves growth and when it is merely a mask. The conclusion is that the unity of work and prayer is a rule of life that encounters real tensions, but is resolved through the discipline of attention and the organization of rhythms. For you, this means starting small. Choose one task and try to perform it with prayerful concentration for a week. If you can maintain that effort, you will see how ordinary work changes the tone of the soul and becomes prayer. Sergius of Radonezhsky left a model in which work and worship live in one breath. Follow that model through concrete practices and with the help of those who know how to lead. If you wish, set down the rule. Every morning, 5 minutes of silence and a short prayer before tasks. First, this will help tune the breath and establish intention. Second, during the day, return to short formulas at transitions. At the end of the week, analyze changes in mood and the quality of work. Record observations, note fatigue and moments of vigor. Do not fear mistakes, they are inevitable. When practice becomes mere mechanics, ask yourself about the meaning and revise the form of prayer. Find a partner. It is twice as easy to keep the rhythm and honestly discuss difficulties. Remember bodily discipline. Breath, pauses, and simple gestures turn prayer into habit. Do not set yourself harsh demands. Be gentle with yourself and consistent in small things. The goal is not outward display, but gradual change of heart, where work and prayer form a single progressive path. And if fatigue or doubt come, return to the beginning, to the short morning silence, to one task done with attention. Thus, steps accumulate into a path. Do not hurry. Each new day is an opportunity to train prayer in action, care for the neighbor, and keep clarity of mind. This is the path on which you will find the strength for perseverance. Be persistent and attentive to the Spirit. Yes. Power is often represented as the ability to demand and impose. The condition of strength is measured by the result of coercion and the speed of will's execution by those who stand above. Sergius of Radonezhsky's vision of power is of another kind. Strength is measured by restraint from coercion, by the ability to lead through persuasion, patience, and personal example. This demand is both a moral imperative and a practical choice at once. The moral imperative rests on the idea of the human being as a creature bearing the image of God, and therefore on a dignity that must not be broken by instruments of coercion. The practical choice is expressed in the fact that public order and genuine change are not created by fear, but formed through inner changes that arise under the influence of example, word, and shared work. Such an approach does not deny the leader's responsibility. It shifts the emphasis from possessing power to responsibility for the hearts of others. Why is this important in conditions of instability and conflict? Because the use of force generates chains of reaction. Suppressing provoked discontent produces new forms of resistance. The legitimacy of power is undermined, and the spiritual soil of society is destroyed. Sergius of Radonezhsky saw that long-term stability is more often based on trust and on the inner consent that is formed not through fear, but through respect. I mean that the moral competence of power consists in the ability to restrain one's authority from turning into an instrument of suppression. How the refusal of coercion works in practice. First, the insistence typical of elderhood is replaced by persistent patience. Second, the leader's word carries weight when it is backed by life and self-discipline. Third, institutions founded on the habit of service and mutual honor create a structure in which violence becomes ineffective and unnecessary. These three elements, personal endurance, the spiritual power of the word, and organizational culture, form the mechanism through which the moral rejection of coercion becomes effective. The consequences of such a mechanism are visible in the long term. Confrontation decreases, trust grows, people take responsibility for the common good. There are also limits. Refusal to apply force does not mean the absence of discipline or the arrival of chaos. Governance requires boundaries and clear rules. Without control and accountability, respect quickly runs out. Therefore, the limit of the moral principle is the combination of the softness of persuasion with the firmness of moral demands. Sergius Radonezhsky emphasized that obedience and discipline are aimed at forming heart and mind, not at mere submission. The leader's responsibility is not to allow the abuse of freedom while preserving the human dignity of those under his care. This principle also affects personal practice. When you manage people or make decisions, remember that power used to avoid responsibility easily turns into a tool of manipulation. True authority is shown in the ability to step back from immediate control for the sake of long-term formation. The leader's inner discipline, the ability to acknowledge one's weakness, ask for counsel, accept criticism, and admit mistakes, becomes the most important resource for maintaining a moral stance. Spiritual discernment here serves as a measure. It allows one to assess when pressure is inevitable because of an external threat, and when pressure is used as a way to avoid inner work. Sergius Radonezhsky saw the difference between the necessity to protect people from imminent danger and the pragmatics of governance that use fear to achieve goals. Discernment requires experience, prayerful vigilance, and often the advice of elders. It sets the boundary between power as protection and power as domination. The sequence of practices deriving from this principle is simple and demanding at the same time. First, cultivate personal endurance and patience through prayer and self-restraint. Second, build institutions where authority is accompanied by transparency and accountability. Third, cultivate a culture of example. The leader lives what he teaches. These practices create an environment in which refusal of violence does not look like violence, but becomes a source of legitimacy. The fixation of the idea is this: non-use of force is an active moral choice that requires discipline, wisdom, and organized support.
For Sergius Radonezhsky, this is not an abstract ideal, but a concrete strategy for community and social life. If you want to apply this principle, start with your own readiness not to respond to provocation with coercion, proportionately strengthen institutions of accountability, and learn to recognize when pressure is justified as protection and when it masks fear or a desire for control. This path is slow, but it creates a durable moral fabric in which power serves rather than breaks. The heart of a leader is formed not by victories through force, but by endurance in renouncing it. This requires courage and constancy. Power that learns to refrain from violence needs regular self-examination, counsel, and readiness to admit mistakes. The practice of such governance consists in small things: the ability to listen, the readiness to change a decision if it causes harm, the construction of mechanisms to protect the weak, and openness to criticism. A leader who takes this path creates an atmosphere where people are not afraid to speak, where honesty is valued above ostentatious efficiency. Over time, such communities demonstrate greater resilience.
Conflicts are resolved peacefully, people take initiative, and trust accumulates like a reserve of strength. This is slow work, requiring constant inner labor and social discipline, but it frees one from the vicious circle of violence. Finally, it is a path not only to better governance, but also to the healing of human hearts. When power serves, it manifests the image of God in society and restores humanity in each participant. This path requires time and patience from everyone, but the return is measured by deep peace and restored trust between people. We choose this path.
The sacralization of place in everyday life turns space into a trainer of the soul. The environment ceases to be a background and begins to set the rhythm of thoughts, bodily habits, and ethical habits. This shows itself through simple mechanisms. When the prayer corner keeps silence, a person's attention learns to fall quiet. When a common meal follows an established order, skills of attentiveness and mutual respect are strengthened. When a house is built with regard for order, labor, and prayer, the body becomes accustomed to the rhythm, and the mind begins to expect the same rituals in difficult situations. These repetitions, absorbing meaning, become an invisible school. Space sets habits. Habits form character. Character shows choices in life. A brief conclusion. Space as pedagogue works slowly but systematically. This can be explained by careful work with bodily life and imagination. Space acts primarily on the body, and through the body on imagination and memory. Different materials, light, smells, and the arrangement of things create conditions for a certain kind of attention. Traditional iconography, the sound of prayer, order in the world of things, direct a person's inclination toward contemplation and labor. In such a field, the heart learns to notice another's suffering, fatigue, and joy, differently than in an atmosphere of constant rush. The habit of placing a cup in its place becomes a sign of respect for the common home. The habit of entering silently before a meal becomes a practice of inner concentration. I notice that these small things add up into a character that more easily accepts moral demands and hardships.
The image helps catch the meaning. Imagine a dwelling where prayer corner is lit by a candle, where the table is neatly laid, where things have their place. Entering such a space acts differently. You step more slowly, your voice lowers, your thoughts straighten. This is not magic, but the effect of repeated practices that translate inner chaos into ordered attentiveness. It is through such small rituals that a person receives upbringing that is not documented in rules, but is felt in behavior and decisions. This educational power of place works both in the city and in the desert, when space is organized to support inner life. The boundary of this idea is clear. Sacralization requires constancy and conscious self-work. Space does not replace personal responsibility and inner labor. Without inner readiness, adherence to forms easily becomes an outward show, lacking depth. For sacralization to bear fruit, it must be combined with instruction, obedience, and sincere service. Otherwise, the space will remain only a beautiful shell that does not affect a person's moral choices. There is a second type of limitation related to cultural context. Different communities understand holiness in different ways, and the same arrangement of everyday life in one place can support life, while in another it can repel people. Sacralization requires flexibility and sensitivity to particular people. Rigid standardization without attention to the vulnerable and to those on the periphery breeds closeness and formalism. Therefore, sacralization must be accompanied by attention to neighbors' needs, openness to differences, and constant testing of practices for living benefit. The connection with Sergius of Radonezhsky's teaching is obvious and multi-layered. In his view, monastic space not only protected from the outside world, it educated people through the orderliness of work and prayer. Sergius of Radonezhsky believed that home and church teach virtue, not only by word, but by the very way of life. His idea was that a place becomes a sanctuary when people serve, work, and pray together, when things and rhythms support the common striving toward God. The heart of the community is formed precisely in conditions where space reflects spiritual priorities. Practically, this means attention to small things: how the prayer corner is arranged, how the meal sounds, how the land and house are cared for. Sergius of Radonezhsky instructed us so that these everyday elements were not secondary. They were a continuation of prayer and service. If you care for a place as something living, this changes your attitude toward other people and toward your own practice. Sacralization requires not decoration, but continual inner work and readiness for service in the framework of everyday life. It is in this aspect that Sergius of Radonezhsky's teaching remains alive for those who want space to help form personality. It is important to emphasize another aspect. Sacralization of space requires communal responsibility. When people share the care of a place, they simultaneously learn to trust and serve one another. This strengthens ties and reduces selfishness. Space as pedagogue actualizes the ethics of small deeds. Not only big decisions, but everyday care for cleanliness, order, and hospitality become a field of spiritual training. Therefore, it is useful to cultivate simple practices of shared labor and discussion. Evening conversations about the day, joint cleanup days, rhythms of prayer and work that repeat and deepen mutual understanding. However, one must remember the boundaries. Sacred space must not join into an ideological trap, where any outside view is perceived as a threat. Openness and readiness for criticism are signs of a healthy community. Be ready to revise habits if they have become a source of exclusion or inconvenience for newcomers. True holiness manifests not in protecting form, but in mercy toward those who have not yet learned the rules. Finally, sacralization of space is a path, not a finish. It does not guarantee holiness, but creates opportunities for it. Constant pedagogy matters, not only through things, but through word, example, and love. Then the house and the prayer corner continue to be a school of the heart, where a person gradually learns to live with God and with neighbors, preserving inner freedom and readiness to serve. This requires patience. Results are often seen only in another generation, but efforts are not wasted. In the practice of community, not only constructive rules matter, but also the ability for merciful flexibility, the skill of accepting people with all the new habits, explaining the meaning of rituals, and together seeking ways that will support rather than suppress. Spiritual pedagogy through place does not cancel individual vocation, but it creates space for its unfolding. Ultimately, sacralization prompts responsibility for the world in which you live. It teaches noticing, restoring, and transmitting valuable forms of life. Thus, the house becomes not merely a refuge, but a continuation of a mission, where daily service and small good deeds form a lived testimony. In practice, this means a constant dialogue between tradition and novelty, respect for forms, and the sane experience of change. Whoever wants to sacralize a place must be at once a keeper and a critic of customs, ready for humility and for experimentation when the good of people requires it. Then the space truly becomes a school for the heart, where prayer, work, and mutual care form an integral path to virtue. It is a continuous work of the heart and the community, requiring love, patience, and constancy. In such an atmosphere, the place becomes a teacher, helping a person to find purpose and to give consolation to neighbors, without pride. The problem is that an image loses its effect when it is perceived as simply a picture or as interior decoration. The image ceases to be a bridge to another level of being and turns into an object of aesthetics or a status symbol. Then it stops eliciting an inner movement that changes heart and behavior. The image remains outside real life, and people become accustomed to the appearance of holiness without experiencing it. This sense of formal sanctity breeds error, when ritual continues, but inner obedience, compassion, and attentiveness do not develop. The criterion by which one can judge the liveliness of an image is simple. The image must activate presence. Presence is not an abstract idea, but a concrete ability to stop the gaze, collect the breath, focus attention, and admit another meaning into oneself. When a person stops before an icon or a symbol, when the image becomes an occasion for silent attention and for a moral decision, then it fulfills its function. The habit of repeated action is important. Not a one-time aesthetic uplift, but a daily return to the sacred meaning. The significance of an image is measured by the extent of its influence on deeds and on the ability to see the neighbor as a presence, not as an object. If the image meets this criterion, the consequences affect both private and public life. At the personal level, the image restores a sense of another plane of reality that does not displace life, but illuminates it. A person begins to see actions in the light of eternity. Ordinary cares acquire depth. At the communal level, the image becomes a means of memory and unity. It reminds of roots, strengthens common orientation, and sustains moral attention in difficult situations. In the social dimension, an icon that functions as a bridge limits the habit of violence and of bureaucratic irresponsibility, because faces and events are seen not only in a utilitarian dimension, but also spiritually. This allows actions to take shape in which compassion and readiness to serve are present. A monk or a layperson who stops before the service and attends to the image returns to the world differently. The voice is softer, decisions more attentive, readiness to help real. Microexample. A person who fixes their gaze on an icon every morning and utters a short inner petition for humility begins to speak differently with neighbors and to relate differently to their responsibilities. In another dimension, the consequences concern the cultivation of taste and the memory of generations. The image fixes the symbols of communal experience, conveys stories of suffering and hope. It is precisely through the repeatability of veneration that the image preserves the meaning of collective service. In the history of religious life, Sergius Radonezhsky emphasized the connection between the image and communal practice. The image did not remain an abstraction. It lived in the order of prayers, in the routine of the table, in labors, and in the words of the elder. Such incorporation of the image into everyday life gives it authority and makes it a source of moral decision. The transforming influence of the image also appears in its ability to heal human attachments. Attention to the image disciplines the imagination and the habit of instant pleasures. Under conditions of repeated prayer, the icon becomes a school of the taming of passions. The desire for glory or wealth is subordinated to the silent face of the saints, presented as a sign of the path. This is not magical influence, but a gradual realignment of orientations. Internal values are rearranged, and through them, behavior is reorganized. For many generations of followers of Sergius of Radonezhsky, just such daily practice created a field of fidelity and readiness to serve neighbors. The criterion of the image's demandingness implies the presence of spiritual discernment. The image is not interpreted arbitrarily. It needs guardianship and explanation. Elders and mentors help a person see what exactly the depiction wants to say to their soul, and how to transfer that into concrete deeds. An icon without instruction risks being read through personal projections and performative desires. Here, what is required is not rigid doctrine, but a method of formation. Reading the image in the context of prayer, conversation about meaning, joint discussion of what is seen. This makes the image act more powerfully and protects it from turning into a mere visual decoration. The limit of the image's action appears in its vulnerability to instrumentalization and ideologization. The danger arises when the image becomes a tool of power or a marker of belonging to interests far from spiritual care for the person. Then the image strengthens group solidarities but does not serve mercy. It consolidates external appearance and defends forms that can justify cruelty. In such conditions, the image ceases to lead to attention and compassion and begins to serve patterns of exclusion and self-justification. Therefore, the community must be vigilant. The image remains effective only if it is tied to real acts of care and service. Another limit relates to cultural context. An image born in one tradition may function differently in another environment and require a translation of meaning. When symbols turn out to be foreign or incomprehensible, they can repel rather than attract. Here, flexibility and the ability to explain are needed to show the connection between the depiction and life. Sergius of Radonezhsky stressed the practical connection between form and content. Images lived in deeds, and therefore their power was preserved even in transitions and changes. Maintaining the power of the image requires constant work in instruction, in service, and in responsible transmission of meaning. So that limitation does not become a dead end, the community and the individual must keep the image within the field of everyday responsibility. That means preserving regularity of worship, teaching how to read the image, linking prayer with deed. Such an approach preserves the bridge between the visible and the invisible worlds. I know people who, through attention to an image, have learned to meet a neighbor's suffering with presence and with action. For those who desire it, the icon remains not an object of worship for the sake of form, but a tool for the formation of the heart. In this sense, Sergius of Radonezhsky leaves a practical instruction. The image must lead into life, and life must confirm the image. Then the symbol truly becomes a reality in which a person learns to see and act in the spirit of love and responsibility. Spiritual discernment is arranged as a set of practices and habits that turn random inner movements into a recognizable sequence. First, an impression, thought, or impulse arises. The mechanism of discernment proposes several steps: stopping and breathing, inwardly naming the experience, comparing it with the prayer rule, attentive observation of bodily and emotional particulars, checking by the fruit of actions and the counsel of an elder or the community. These steps work together and operate as an instrumental complex. Silence and prayer give space for clarification. Bodily asceticism removes the noise of desires. Obedience in the community subjects experience to public testing, and observing the fruits shows where the soul's movement leads. In parallel, the skill of discerning motives develops, the striving for glory, fear, desire to avoid responsibility, sincere compassion, desire to serve. The systematization of practice makes discernment not a one-time act, but a continuous work of life. Why such a mechanism is needed? The human heart is multi-layered, and the same psychic form can have different sources. Prayerful inspiration sometimes comes as a faint hint, sometimes as an intrusive image, sometimes as a demanding feeling. Discernment helps not to succumb to the first impression and to distinguish the voice that calls for love and sacrifice from the voice that demands comfort or inner praise. In a community, the ability to recognize movements of the soul protects against false authority and fanaticism. For the individual, it preserves freedom. Decisions are made not under pressure of instantaneous emotions, but in accordance with stable values and verifiable fruits. For spiritual guidance, discernment is a way to direct people to where their gift truly serves, and not where it destroys. Where the mechanism breaks. The first break is haste. The desire to have clarity immediately forces one to shorten the path of discernment to an instant decision. Then, feelings are labeled as inspiration, without checking the fruits and without counsel. The second break is pride and the desire to stand out. When a person strives to appear spiritual, they interpret any inner movement as grace, and this deprives life of bridges into the community. The third break is isolation. Separated from the community and the elder, the practice turns into a private interpretation, and mistakes become entrenched. The fourth break is emotional dependence. If discernment is reduced to seeking confirmation through emotional experiences, then any stable decision depends on mood swings rather than on the measure of love. The fifth break is instrumentalization of authority. When a teacher or an institution uses discernment to strengthen power, the voice of discernment becomes a tool of manipulation. The sixth break is connected with cultural loss of language. Symbols and biblical images lose common meaning, so interpretations diverge between generations and groups. In all these cases, the procedure remains an external form, and the service that should be the criterion loses its meaning. The mechanism further breaks down through the loss of habits that feed it. Prayer regimen, fasting, regular confession, obedience, reading of scriptures. These are not fashionable attributes, but working parts of the instrument. If someone neglects these particulars, discernment begins to function worse. The heart becomes prone to self-justification, and the desire to preserve comfort drowns out the voice of conscience. Another vulnerability is lack of time. Discernment requires patience, sometimes months of waiting to see the fruit. A fast decision culture discards such patience. In such conditions, mistaken decisions become the norm and solidify as spiritual revelations. The conclusion follows from the very structure of the mechanism. Restoration of discernment begins with the revival of simple rituals that make the heart attentive and obedient. Skills can be strengthened systematically. Stop each day in prayer and note internal movements. Regularly check your decisions about service. Consult those who have experience and endure the test of time. Here, the timid words of pastors from the life of Sergius of Radonezhsky find practical application. Sergius of Radonezhsky showed that instruction and the guidance of elders are not a renunciation of freedom, but an environment for its maturity. His life emphasized that discernment grows where the habits of worship, obedience, and labor are joined in a single rule of life. If you want to bring discernment back into your practice, start small and long term. Develop the habit of stopping an impulse and silently naming what happened inside. Tell this to an elder or another trusted person and ask for their observation. Watch what fruits appear in actions after a month and after 6 months. Train the body with simple restrictions that cleanse the will of impulsiveness. Create around yourself a space where decisions are tested by the community, not only by personal feeling. Such an approach gently protects the community from institutional hardness and will preserve the individual from false self-satisfaction. A small and concrete conclusion. Spiritual discernment is a skill that requires time, practice, and honest accounting of fruits. It does not arise as a one-time gift, but grows in common life and in a rule. Sergius of Radonezhsky believed that the true spirit is tested in deeds of love and obedience. If you train attention, patience, and readiness for counsel, discernment will become an instrument that preserves the freedom of the heart and directs actions in service to the neighbor. Why prepare for death already now? Preparation for death for Sergius of Radonezhsky occupied not the fringe of spiritual life, but its flesh. It is not abstract theology, but a set of habits that translate the idea of death from a distant thought into a concrete discipline of the heart. The point is to live as if each day could be the last, while remaining calm, hardworking, and compassionate. For Sergius, the thought of the end was a school for proper behavior. It set the measure of honesty and depth of relations with God and with people. Laying out this teaching, one should single out several interconnected aspects. The first aspect is the remembrance of death as a regular practice. The second is the humility that is formed in the recognition of one's finitude. The third is order in life, a prayer rule, fasting, work, and responsibility toward neighbors. The fourth is the community as the place that tests readiness, not solitary reflection, but the turning of life toward one another. These aspects work together. Remembrance of death cultivates simplicity of desires. Humility purifies intentions. Ordered life provides a check on how much inner movements correspond to love and duty. The community confirms or refutes personal assertions of spirituality through deeds. Practices that support this readiness are simple and concrete. Regular prayer and brief reflection on mortality, confession and asking for advice, moderation in needs, a nightly or evening accounting of the day lived, participation in communal labors. These elements create a framework in which attention to death does not destroy, but strengthens. They work quietly. The daily habit of looking back at the day lived, admitting fault, and asking forgiveness changes behavior faster than a grand promise to become a better person tomorrow. When such discipline enters life, perception of time changes. The attitude to plans, to risks, to relationships becomes strict and gentle at once. Strict in fidelity to commitments, gentle in relation to those who err. Awareness of finitude diminishes hysterical striving for self-promotion and increases the desire to serve. Actions acquire weight because you think about what fruits they will bear, not only now, but in the final accounting before yourself and the community. Sergius of Radonezhsky understood this as the formation of the heart that learns to answer for the gifted talents and for those who are near. A person's inner psychology is also restructured. Fear of death can take the form of flight or aggression, or it can become the driving force toward honesty and compassion. Labor fatigue and bodily limitations incline one toward humility and attention to the neighbor who is weaker. Understanding limitation increases attention to those who suffered and trains the capacity to forgive. For a leader who lives in this key, decisions acquire a long-term orientation, not the satisfaction of immediate popularity, but care for what will remain for people after his activity. A life prepared for death manifests steadiness in crisis and attention to subsequent generations. How to bring this practice into everyday life? Start with small repeatable acts, a pause before sleep and a brief accounting of the day, uttering a simple prayer for those who suffer, practicing moderation in food and entertainments, readiness to accept reproach and correct an action. You can agree with someone in the community or a friend to exchange observations about spiritual state. Regularity is more important than dramatic efforts. Gradual cultivation of discipline makes preparation a habit, and habit protects against sudden moral breakdowns. The reason for this approach is simple. Finitude gives measure, technique gives form, the community gives testing. Finitude awakens seriousness of intention. The technique of habits, prayer, fasting, work, holds attention and forms the will. The community shows fruits and gives counsel. As a result, a person becomes capable of being reliable in deeds, calm in trials, and generous in service. This combination leads to social benefit. People raised in this way strengthen common morality and reduce the risk of presumptuous decisions that harm many. The limits of this practice are also obvious and require honest handling. Fixation on death can become an escape from responsibility if it serves as a justification for passivity or withdrawal from the world. Religious glorification of asceticism, if it turns into display, devalues sincerity. Authorities who use the theme of death to suppress and instill fear distort its meaning, turning it into an instrument of power. Therefore, preparation must be combined with active service, openness to counsel, and respect for the lives of others. For Sergius of Radonezhsky, preparation for the end was always linked with care for the neighbor and with spiritual honesty before the community. To conclude plainly, preparation for death is practical wisdom for life. It requires work and habit. It soothes fear and increases readiness to serve. If you begin to live as if the limit is near, you will see that petty offenses lose power, and great deeds gain clarity. Sergius of Radonezhsky taught that readiness for the end is measured by deeds of love and obedience. Take small steps, keep order in life, heed counsel, and be ready to answer honestly to the look of a neighbor at the last hour. This readiness guards the heart and makes life meaningful. The result of consistent peacemaking on the part of a leader manifests in the fact that trust forms around him, violence decreases, and the community's ability to live together grows. People begin to rely not on the force of command, but on the willingness to conduct dialogue and preserve honor in word and deed. This trust becomes a saving of moral resources, less fear, fewer hidden aggressions, more joint efforts for the common good. When such habits are established, decisions acquire a long-term perspective because they undergo the test of conscience and communal responsibility, not merely the interests of short-term gain. Why this works? A leader's peacemaking acts as a causal mechanism. It shifts conflict from the sphere of force into the sphere of trust. When one who has influence demonstrates readiness to listen and not to resort to coercion, expectations among others change. Expectation ceases to be based on fear of punishment and moves toward reliance on justice and restoration of relationships. This transition requires skills: the ability to listen, to set boundaries without humiliation, to admit one's mistakes. It is precisely the combination of emotional endurance and moral firmness that makes peacemaking effective. The image will help to understand what it means to take on the role of peacemaker. Imagine a long wooden table in a cold house, around which people with different grievances gather. One who sits in the middle and silently gives the floor to each who is ready to speak already takes a step toward peace. Words about shared responsibility and a promise to help restore damaged relations work more powerfully when concrete action follows them. Shared labor, joint work in the field or in the communal kitchen. A small example. After a nighttime quarrel between two village elders, the leader proposed that everyone repair the broken bridge together. And in the course of the shared work, irritation gave way to the habit of helping one another. This short episode shows that peacemaking does not remain a word. It is measured by deed. The connection of this practice with the thoughts of Sergius of Radonezhsky is obvious in his emphasis on persuasion and service instead of coercion. For Sergius of Radonezhsky, authority is based on spiritual honesty and example, not on formal power. He encouraged resolving conflicts through prayer, humility, and concrete help, through division of labor and support. Where authority functions as service, people learn to trust and to imitate. I saw how, in a discussion about a dispute over the harvest, respect for the elder's voice changed the tone of the dialogue and lowered the heat of the grievances. This is what he called an act of love aimed at restoring unity. The consequences of this approach go beyond a one-time reconciliation. A steady practice of peacemaking forms moral habits across whole generations. Children who observe adults resolving conflicts with a voice of conscience and a readiness to restore relationships internalize the pattern and later become more cautious in words and deeds themselves. In the political sphere, this reduces elites' readiness to use force for personal gain, because public legitimacy shifts toward those who know how to unite. For the community, this means resilience in crisis and the ability to recover without external coercive administration. What skills does a leader need to be a peacemaker continuously rather than episodically? First, the ability to listen without hasty judgment. Second, the ability to articulate criteria of justice that are understandable to everyone and preserve respect for human dignity. Third, a willingness to act together with others, offer labor, share resources, take on part of the responsibility. These practices are combined with inner discipline, prayer, self-control, and regular self-reflection. It is precisely the combination of inner work and external steps that makes peacemaking sustainable. Turning to practice for you can look simple. Start with a small action that shows you value the relationship more than winning the argument. Come to the conversation with the intention of restoring connection, not of winning the dispute. Offer a concrete gesture of support that will reduce material tension between the parties in conflict. I suggest one simple step. Meet an involved person separately. Listen to them without interrupting, and then return to the general conversation with an offer of concrete joint work. This technique reduces emotional intensity and converts the conflict into a common task. The limits of this approach are also worth mentioning. Peacemaking requires honesty and a readiness to set boundaries. Restraint in decisions does not mean silent agreement with injustice. A leader who strives for peace is obliged to protect the vulnerable, to speak the truth, and to take measures that will restore justice. These measures should be accompanied by transparency and community support so that they do not become personal retribution. The author's role in this is not coercive power, but creating a framework where restoration and justice go hand in hand. Returning to the personality of Sergius of Radonezh, it is clear that his peacemaking had a method: prayer for the parties, a personal example of humility, participation in labor, and care for people's everyday needs. Sergius of Radonezh believed that a peacemaker must above all serve, and service builds the trust necessary for peaceful coexistence. He used symbols of communal life as tools that remind people of shared responsibility, thereby translating abstract notions of justice into concrete rituals of care. If you want to try this path, start with a habit, one sincere attempt a week to establish peace through action. Take a step that brings people together around shared work, and observe how the tone of their conversations changes. Peacemaking requires the courage for vulnerability and the discipline for firmness at the same time. I believe that by following this line, you will see public health strengthen, and you will feel that personal spiritual practice truly affects the world around you. When one spiritual person enters the public field and behaves like a saint, it instantly changes the tone of the conversation around him. It is not about loud statements, but about how his calm, readiness to serve, and habit of prayer make arguments softer and more comprehensible. Where the word sounds not as an instrument of power, but as a testimony to inner truth, people tend to listen differently. Such concrete situations occur often. The presence of a person whose deeds and prayerful life are visible can cool passions and inspire a desire to restore relationships. The mechanism of this transformation is simple, and at the same time deeper than it appears at first glance. Personal holiness creates trust, and that trust makes a new form of political dialogue possible. People begin to evaluate proposals not only by benefit, but by whether a decision corresponds to dignity and honor. At the core is a moral chain. Deeds form expectations. Expectations influence behavior, and behavior consolidates norms. As a result, not only the tone of negotiations changes, but also the criteria of legitimacy for those participating in public life. This phenomenon is universal and repeats across different cultures and eras. When personal holiness becomes a public factor, it functions as intangible capital. It is expressed in the ease of mobilizing people for common work, in the reduced need for coercion, and in the community's ability to resist arbitrariness. Models of action by a person who lives according to conscience and prayer are reproduced through imitation, through rituals of joint work, and through practices of mutual aid. For society, this means that moral orientations spread not through formal instructions, but through living example. The cause, structure, and consequences of this process consist of three connected links. The cause is the constant alignment of word and deed, a lifestyle noticeable to others. The structure is the mechanism of trust that is formed thanks to the repeatability of good deeds, honesty in small things, and willingness to self-sacrifice for the common good. The consequences are a reduced readiness to resort to force, strengthened solidarity, and institutional resilience at the level of everyday practices. These three elements work together. Without consistency of action, trust will not arise, and without trust, good intentions will remain merely a personal trait, not turning into a public resource. The connection of this with the ideas of Sergius of Radonezhsky is evident in how he built his presence in society. For Sergius of Radonezhsky, holiness was not a secluded category, but social energy. Prayer, fasting, and labor were ways of giving and strengthening common life. His habit of participating in people's everyday life, sharing their work, praying with them, and teaching through practice created the very moral reputation I speak of. Individual acts combined into an example that others could measure and reproduce. The practices through which personal holiness is expressed in the public sphere are fairly simple and concrete. Systematic service in small deeds, honest speech, willingness to acknowledge and correct mistakes, the ability to accept those who suffer. All this works as social cement. Rituals of shared work and communal prayers consolidate the experience of solidarity and translate individual good acts into durable norms. For the community, this means not a mystique of exceptionality, but a daily discipline of good habits that reproduce trust. The limits of the power of personal holiness are also clear and require attention. A person's influence is limited by his own integrity and by social conditions. When character is weak and words diverge from deeds, expectations turn into disappointment and even cynicism. When a community depends too much on one person, the risk of distorting power grows. Authority can turn into a cult of personality, and then holiness becomes an instrument of influence without feedback. To prevent this, mechanisms of accountability and transparency within collective practices are necessary. Another limit is structural circumstances. Personal holiness helps soften conflicts and strengthen trust, but it does not by itself resolve economic imbalances, institutional corruption, or external aggression. Holiness acts as a catalyst for moral behavior, but transforming systems requires organizational work, legal institutions, and the distribution of resources. In places where these elements are missing, even the sincerest holiness encounters limits to its influence. If you want your personal spirituality to become a living resource for those around you, treat it as a long-term practice. Do small, honest deeds regularly. Speak the truth so that it heals rather than destroys. Participate in common work and share responsibility. Prayer and labor, repeated together, create an effect of presence. People notice constancy and begin to trust. At the same time, don't seek instant recognition. Lasting influence comes through years of consistent living. Look at the figure of Sergius of Radonezhsky as an invitation to such a style of life. The power of his influence lay in the fact that personal holiness served the common good, not an end in itself. It gave people points of orientation and a model of behavior that was easily replicated in everyday deeds. Understanding the limits and possibilities of this path, you can build your influence so that it truly changes the public atmosphere. Faith is a pattern of vision, a habit of looking at the world through a particular network of meanings and connections. It sets the frame for questions about good and evil, about the meaning of work and rest, about what deserves attention and to what degree. Faith as a mode of everyday sight manifests in how a person evaluates events, how he resolves minor domestic contradictions, what he spends time and energy on. It is not abstract dogma, but a constant practical optics that shapes the taste of actions, discerns priorities, and makes visible what would otherwise be overlooked. Tension arises because everyday life resists a sealed, ideal faith. Routine cares demand quick decisions. Economic circumstances dictate pragmatic compromises. Fatigue eats away attention. In such conditions, faith easily becomes a word or a ritual separated from deeds. Another aspect of the tension is an inner conflict, the desire to be faithful to the ideal and the real necessity to care for family, pay bills, and fulfill obligations to the community. Yet another tension is internal blindness, when thinking habits are so entrenched that even close spiritual practices lose freshness and turn into automatic movements. These sources of stress act constantly, and their influence shows up in the fragmentation of life's integrity into spiritual and ordinary. Resolution begins with the rule. Faith becomes everyday sight through the systematic retraining of attention. This is not a one-off fashion, but a discipline of perception. The practice consists in cultivating short, regular acts of attention that return the heart and mind to the primary reasons of meaning. Prayer, even the briefest, an intentional framing before beginning a task, gratitude at the end of the day, attentive listening to another person. All this restructures the fabric of the day into a new pattern. When such acts are repeated, they act as a small reconstruction of reality. Important things gain a center of gravity. The secondary recedes to the periphery. It is through disciplined repetition that faith ceases to be an abstraction and enters the flesh of everyday experience. How faith stops being a set of words and becomes a way of seeing the world in every moment. The mechanism is simple in design and complex in implementation. First, a rule of attention is formed. Then this rule gets a body through practices, habits, and rituals. Finally, a group of people living the same habits supports one another and makes the vision stable. Sergius of Radonezhsky demonstrated this path in his way of life. Prayer turned into labor. Labor became prayer, and the whole day acquired the sacred linkage. Through such everyday links, faith became not decoration, but a structure of community perception. The image helps to sense the difference without excess words. Faith as glasses through which you look. Glasses that correct the crooked, sharpen colors, and make small details distinguishable. If the glasses are clean and of good quality, the world appears clear and manageable. If the lenses are dusty or distorted, colors blend and what is important slips away. The task is to keep these glasses in working order. Clean them with regular care. Replace them as life changes. Pass them on to those in need. In Sergius of Radonezhsky's tradition, such care for vision manifested in regular communal prayers, work hand in hand, and continuous practice of mutual help. Analytically, one can distinguish three links: source, mechanism, and consequence. The source is the conscious intention to make faith a pattern of action. The mechanism is the set of practices that place this intention in daily decisions and rituals. The consequence is a shift in perception that leads to different choices, to changing disciplines, and to the formation of a new ethics of everyday life. When all three work in concert, the result is not illusory. Relationships become more attentive, decisions more responsible. Public norms begin to be reinforced by living practice and not only by words. Sergius of Radonezhsky showed this precisely as a sequence. Personal discipline became a public standard. The dangers of this path are real and require protection. The first danger is the loss of sincerity through formal performance of practices. The second is replacing critical thinking with automatic rituals that give a sense of righteousness, but do not change attitudes toward others. The third is the tendency to use religious lifestyle as an instrument of influence without genuine service. The antidote is simple and practical: honest self-assessment, regular spiritual discernment, sincere accountability before fellow companions. It is important that practices are not a pretext for self-justification, but tools for constant return to the work of service. The practice offered heals tension when it is integrated into the body of the community. Prayer, labor, dialogue, and care for the neighbor serve as binding tissues. The internal scheme is simple. Small regular acts revive attention. Attention changes choice. Choice forms habit. Habit gives faith the status of a way of seeing. Through this line, faith begins to affect institutions and relationships, because people living in this way make decisions differently. Sergius of Radonezhsky left a trace in that personal sanctification became the foundation for public life, and this remains applicable today. If you want faith to become your constant sight, start small and with honesty. Form one simple habit that returns you to your orientation. Share life with those who are ready for similar discipline. Control your motives and ask for help when the vision darkens. Faith as a mode of everyday vision takes time, but it is through time that it turns private aspirations into a public resource. Sergius of Radonezhsky's examples belong to such a life, where faith is visible in every step and where everyday life itself becomes a school of insight. Rank is often visible by outward signs, by the stars on shoulders, and by the words said about a person. Service is visible by who comes first to the one in need, who stays when conversations end, and by how deeds change the people around. This single contrast shapes the whole meaning of the criterion of power that Sergius of Radonezhsky both spoke and lived by. Service as the basis of authority turns power into responsibility. Authority grounded in service does not rely on commands and formal powers. It is built on trust, given to a person noticed for continuous care. Sergius of Radonezhsky showed that true gratitude of the people and community is created not by declaiming merits, but by a constant readiness to work alongside others, to pray for them and to shoulder burdens. When a leader makes service the measure of his decency, he simultaneously opens space for mutual growth and protects the community from the arbitrariness of those who hide words behind the luxury of titles. One short incident explains much. A monk sat through a cold night at a dying man's side, trimmed the thin threads of his garments, and by morning tactfully placed a cloth over his face. The next morning nobody spoke of a great feat, but neighbors came for consolation and help with simple matters. The cause, structure, and consequence of this model are clear and simple. The cause is the need for trust that gives the community stability. The structure is the regular practice of service, labor, care, presence, that become habit and visible proof of inner orientation. The consequence is authority recognized as a moral orientation. Decisions are made differently because people follow example, not title. This analytic move shows why service acts as a filter. It admits those ready for real responsibility and exposes those who only claim power. Service gives authority through three connected qualities. The first is visible consistency. People notice that help is not episodic, but a rule of life. The second is shared participation. The one who serves shares need rather than distances himself. The third is modest effectiveness. Help is aimed at the good, not at show. When these qualities meet in one person, his words gain weight because they are confirmed by deed. Spiritual influence in such a case does not oppress or coerce, it motivates and orients. The dangers are real too and cannot be ignored. Service can be imitated for prestige, and then authority becomes farce. One can begin to regard service as a tool for elevation, forgetting the humility that must remain its core. A cult of personality may arise when individual acts are heroized and used to strengthen power without accountability. The safeguard is the habit of accountability before one's neighbors, regular discernment of motives, and the simple habit of asking, how does my action help the one weaker than me? Sergius of Radonezhsky left not only examples of service, but also a culture of responsibility, where being held to account before the community was normal. The practice of service as a criterion requires structural support. Rules are needed that encourage labor and care and at the same time demand reporting. A field of trust forms around the leader if the community sees this leader's constant participation in affairs and not only formal words. Service must be a habit, visible and repeatable. Then authority ceases to be personal capital and becomes a public resource. Spiritual eldership in the time of Sergius of Radonezhsky was precisely that. The elder lived among the people, worked with them, and through this gained the right to speak and guide. You can observe authority around you by a simple sign. People go not to beautiful speeches, but to where they receive help and a sense of support. Watch how leaders allocate their time, whom they devote their efforts to, how they respond to weakness. Do a little test within yourself. Who inspires your trust? The one who takes on work, or the one who only proclaims it? This inner filter helps keep clarity in complex situations. Consolidating the principle requires practical steps. Identify in your surroundings those forms of service that are sustainable and not dependent on applause. Encourage those who remain in the silence of work. Take on the simple obligation of helping at least one person regularly, and observe how this changes your position and others' perception of you. The belief that service is the criterion of authority turns into a real power for society when such acts become the norm rather than the exception. The image of Sergius of Radonezhsky remains an orienting point. He was respected not for titles, but for the relief he brought, for working alongside people, and for not allowing power to drown out the voice of compassion. Sergius of Radonezhsky's spiritual legacy shows how service can build institutions that live long and justly. If you look at leaders through the prism of their service, you will see the kind of power that can truly transform life around. Accept this as a criterion that tests words by deed, and the community itself will start to respond to such authority with reciprocal trust and responsibility. Service founded on constancy and humility cultivates trust and responsibility. It strengthens common life and turns power into service rather than claim. Believe and serve. Sincerely here. Service founded on constancy and humility fosters trust and responsibility. It strengthens communal life and makes authority a service rather than a claim. Believe and serve. Sincerely here. Service founded on constancy and humility fosters trust and responsibility. It strengthens communal life and makes authority a service rather than a claim. Believe and serve. Sincerely here. Service founded on constancy and humility fosters trust and responsibility. It strengthens communal life and makes authority a service rather than a claim. Believe and serve. Sincerely here. Service founded on constancy and humility fosters trust and responsibility. It strengthens communal life and makes authority a service rather than a claim. Believe and serve. Sincerely here. Small acts of goodness shape history as reliably as small building blocks create a house. This statement is not an embellishment of thought, but a practical model. Regular, simple actions change a person's character, the structure of a community, and, ultimately, public life. A small gesture, repeated by many and with consistency, becomes a social habit, a norm that replaces empty slogans and destructive traditions. The mechanism is simple. The first link is the inner habit. When a person regularly shows care, their will is strengthened, the tendency towards selfishness is restrained, and a steadfast readiness to help emerges. The second link is social connection. Goodness attracts trust, and trust creates a network of mutual obligations without formal contracts. The third link is institutionalization. Recurring good practices become embedded in customs, rites, rules of communal life, and begin to operate independently of particular individuals. This sequence of causes, arrangements, and consequences shows how what seems small and private gains mass force. One inner feature makes small deeds especially effective: their accessibility.
A mass ethic is formed not from the feats of a minority, but from the routine acts of the majority. When you do something simple, it becomes an example that is easy to repeat. Repeatability leads to the standardization of kindness. It ceases to be an exception and becomes the measure of ordinary behavior. Through this standardization, people's expectations of one another change, and the pressure of the norm begins to work toward creation rather than destruction. The limits of this movement are real and must be kept in view. Goodness remains vulnerable if it loses connection with inner sincerity. If deeds become ritual for the sake of status or an instrument of influence, their creative power declines. The system of actions requires support through discernment, constant checking of motives, open accountability, a simple habit of acknowledging mistakes and learning. Structural support is also needed. Habits must be built into everyday life through schedules, places, duties, and shared practices. Otherwise, isolated good gestures quickly fall apart. The role of a leader in this process is not to command goodness by decree, but to strengthen the habit in others by example. A leader who acts daily alongside people creates a mirror effect. Their behavior becomes modelable and accepted. When the one who leads shares the work and care, they increase the likelihood that simple acts will become a collective habit. This principle of service as a criterion of authority arises from practice, not from declarations. Honesty in motives and clarity of purpose are key conditions. Goodness that is not accompanied by a readiness to bear responsibility risks becoming mere ornament. Therefore, regular reflection and asking counsel from those nearby are important. A community must have simple ways to test sincerity: discussing motives, jointly evaluating results, a readiness to change approach. This forms a collective immunity against hypocrisy and showiness. Connection with spiritual life gives small deeds depth. When an action is perceived as service to God through one's neighbor, it ceases to be only a social act and becomes a spiritual practice. This does not add external complexity. On the contrary, simplicity is strengthened. Help is perceived as an obligation of the heart, not as a random charitable gesture. Such sacralization of the everyday supports the durability of the habit and protects it from selfishness. The principle of small deeds has an ethical side. It cultivates responsibility through the accessibility of action. One who is used to caring for small things more easily endures larger duties, because will and attention are already trained. The education of responsibility begins with the small and gradually expands the individual's field of action. Thus, moral capital is formed, which can be passed on within the family and across the wider community. Sergius of Radonezhsky often returned attention to the significance of small efforts, emphasizing that it is precisely constancy in simple practices that creates the spiritual strength of a community.
His approach can be called a pedagogy of small deeds. He systematically supported forms of life that required everyday participation and made it impossible to do without helping one's neighbor. This pedagogy worked through example, through common labor, through prayer and work that were joined in one rhythm of life. An important practical thought is that turning individual acts into a lasting habit requires collective accord, agreement that such actions are valued and repeated. Without this, efforts remain isolated and do not affect structure. Communal rituals, allocation of duties, honors for long service, all this helps to solidify good practices and prevent their decay into mere stereotypes. Sergius of Radonezhsky saw that small deeds lead to large changes when they are connected with inner honesty and common practice. He formed institutions and customs in which simple care was the norm, not the exception. If you take this on as a personal task, you will begin to change the circles of your influence without grand gestures. The small, repeated rightly, becomes great. Sergius of Radonezhsky often returned to the thought of the power of constancy and showed how unpretentious acts create lasting moral foundations of society. Make this choice a habit, and what begins with you will grow into a force that transforms the space around you. The problem is that care for the poor and hospitality easily turn into formality. People see a problem, give one-time help and move on, leaving the trauma of poverty unaddressed. Frequent charitable campaigns remain episodes that do not touch hearts and do not change the social fabric. This creates a condition where help exists as scheduled action and as an element of image rather than as a deep moral practice. Hunger, cold, loss of housing and loneliness retain their destructive influence when attention weakens after the first gesture. The criterion of true hospitality and care sets the spiritual measure of actions. According to Sergius of Radonezhsky, hospitality is not simply the distribution of food or clothing. It is the inclusion of a person into the space of the community, into its rhythm of prayer and work. Important signs are constancy of help, respect for the person, the possibility for the needy to take part in common affairs, shared prayer and communal meals as elements of inclusion, and responsibility of the receiving side for the guest's further fate. Actions are assessed by these signs. If help remains one-off and anonymous, it does not satisfy the criteria of true hospitality. If help becomes a family responsibility with participation and prayer, it fulfills a spiritual function. For practice, it is enough to remember 3 directions: accessibility, duration, preservation of dignity. If communal behavior meets these criteria, the consequences are deeper than simple temporary support. Constant inclusion of the needy in communal life changes those who give help as well. A person who regularly seats the poor at the table and at prayer reorients their habits, learns generosity and attentiveness. The community acquires stable forms of mutual care that resist loneliness and social isolation. In such practices, moral responsibility develops. Places are assigned not by status, but by need, and this forms a new order of values. For those who receive help, there appears a chance to restore labor and social activity, receive training or a craft, join shared work and prayer. The effect of collective action is reflected in institutions as well. Customs, rules of shared life and practices emerge that are then reproduced and passed on. If help lacks constancy and respect, the consequences are different. Superficial charity can strengthen dependency and the feeling of humiliation. When help is given without involvement and without simple social obligations, it often fixes a person in the role of a passive recipient. Social distance between those who give and those who receive grows. The community loses the opportunity to cultivate virtues through joint work and prayer. Economic and psychological consequences are long-term. the incentive for recovery disappears, the support for change vanishes. A system of aid that does not rest on the criteria of constancy and respect risks becoming a farce, where kindness is measured by the number of handouts rather than by the transforming power of life together. The boundaries of hospitality practice must be specified honestly. There are limits to the resources and capacities of each community and each person. One cannot expect a single community to solve all the causes of poverty, which are often tied to the economy, state policy, and historical injustices. Hospitality works within the limits of personal and communal responsibility. It requires discernment. Help should support dignity and create possibility for further participation in life, not foster harmful dependencies. Sometimes it is appropriate to introduce conditions related to work, training, or routine so that help does not replace the primary task, restoring human autonomy. The community leader is obliged to protect the weak from exploitation, and at the same time not to allow goodness to be used to the detriment of others. Sergius of Radonezhsky saw hospitality as a form of prayerful service. This understanding changes the shape of help. Food and shelter become means of spiritual participation. In the evening, at the meal, the one who came for the cup becomes a participant in prayer and conversation, not only an object of mercy. Such an order removes distance and returns a person's name, face, and role in the community. I noticed that the discipline required for genuine care is most often formed through habit. The habit of working together and sharing meals creates natural entry points for those in need. Work duties give meaning and structure to the day. Prayer gives support and inner stability. And shared responsibility teaches that everyone is responsible both for themselves and for others. This combination of practices is the criterion by which the depth of hospitality is judged. One small scene illustrates the essence. A person comes to the chapel with a tiny bag. They are welcomed and led to the common table, where a prayer is read before the meal. After this, they are offered work in the garden and a place to sleep. Such a course of action changes a person's situation more than a one-time distribution of food. Leadership in matters of hospitality requires wisdom and humility. Sergius of Radonezhsky emphasized that the leader should not impose help by orders. He must set an example, organize structure, and protect the weak from humiliation. The leader's example sets the tone. If he participates in the meal and in the work with those he helps, doing so without ostentation, the community learns to accept both hosts and the poor as equals in human dignity. There is another boundary rarely spoken aloud. Hospitality requires constant reflection on motives. If help becomes an instrument of power, a way of managing, or a means to show one's kindness to the public, its strength disappears. A genuine act preserves inner purity when offered without demanding recognition. This condition remains a test for everyone involved in the practice of hospitality.
Sergius of Radonezhsky left us not only a pattern of action, but also a criterion for evaluating these actions. He taught that true care includes prayer, work, and respect. If you want to change your environment, start by inviting to the table and working alongside those in need. Such simple but constant action changes people and institutions, restores human dignity, and creates the foundation for a just life. Prayerful leadership means authority that is born not from command and office, but from steady spiritual practice and service. A leader prays before making decisions, participates in common prayers, works alongside the people for whom he bears responsibility, and through personal spiritual work
earns trust. Such authority manifests itself in the ability to be a support, in calm clarity of decisions, and in the ability to attract others to shared life rather than to impose rules. The mechanism of prayerful leadership is simple and at the same time deep. Prayer sharpens vision. It attunes the leader to the needs of people and to real circumstances. It teaches waiting and discernment. When decisions pass through prayer, they become less reactive and more capable of long-term community well-being. Prayer disciplines the will. It reduces passionate impulses and helps decisions be born in a spirit of responsibility rather than in a desire to display power. Practices that support such authority are concrete. The leader participates in the common meal and in the work. He openly acknowledges his mistakes. He asks the elders for counsel and gives space to the voices of those who are usually silent. He establishes a regular rhythm of prayer and reflection, while not shutting down discussion of practical questions. His word becomes weighty because it has been repeatedly tested by inner work, not because it comes from an office. The benefit of this manner of leadership is felt in the community's daily life. Decisions are made more slowly, but they serve the common stability. People are more willing to take responsibility when they see the leader beside them in work and prayer, rather than above them. The leader's inner calm prevents many conflicts before they grow into discord. Moral authority earned through service keeps people from the temptation to use force to achieve goals. Dangers and distortions are real as well. Prayer can become a cover for inaction if silence hides the inability to take difficult decisions. A leader's character can turn into charisma that blocks scrutiny and accountability. Then the prayerful tradition works as an alibi for vertical power. Administrative routine can absorb spiritual life when schedules and regulations displace common service. In such situations, transparency disappears, decision-making circles close, and help loses its face because it lacks accountability and love. The boundaries of applying prayerful leadership are tied to the reality of resources and structures. Prayer does not replace the need for clear rules, financial discipline, and professional management skills. Issues of safety, law, and economic sustainability require competence and formal procedures. Therefore, prayerful leadership needs institutions of control, clear responsibilities, public accountability, time for discussion, and the ability to review decisions. Prayer makes a decision wise and good. Structure makes it feasible and honest. The routine of humble service helps avoid distortions. Regular rotation of duties, the leader's participation in simple community tasks, transparent meetings, and open discussion of motives maintains a balance between spiritual depth and administration. Eldership and mutual accountability strengthen control over potential abuse, because experience and prayerful discernment bring clarity and calm to discussions about authority. This leadership anchors earlier ideas. Prayer as presence gives measure to decisions. Humility makes them flexible. Obedience and labor form the character of those who lead and those who are led. When authority is born in service and confirmed by service, the community learns freedom, not slavery to forms. Faith is expressed not in dogma, but in the leader's way of life, his readiness to serve and not demand honors, but to accept responsibility. Such a style of authority affects society. It shows that authority can be a source of healing and unity. Key ideas sound simple. Prayer as the source of authority, service as the test of words, humility as the guarantee of listening, transparency as protection against abuse, labor as a means of participation. These propositions form a practical matrix. Spiritual depth adds meaning, and organization gives it form. Together, they create a stable and living community. If you're responsible for people, begin by truly praying and listening before making a decision. Do the work alongside those you lead. Keep accountability and invite the elders to join discernment. Spiritual leadership is shown in deeds, not in title. Good night.